It's interesting to present a story that is so well known and beloved that it's been around for literally millennia, and people know exactly how it works out. So how do you make it interesting, viable, entertaining, and make people want to tune in week after week? Some staying up after 12:01 a.m. to make sure we get the next installment right when it drops. That's the conundrum the creators of House of David have faced. And they've handled that situation in various ways, some more shocking than others. Today, let's look at the basic plot of Season 1, Episode 1, The Shepherd and the King. The title itself sets up the central conflict in David's story as relates to Saul, between living life for the glory of God, which David does, or living life for the glory of yourself, which is what Saul does. The moment you click on the screen to watch the show, there's a disclaimer saying that some of the events depicted may not accurately represent historical or biblical facts or figures, and that they do their best to portray certain aspects of history authentically. But of course, they need to take creative liberties for the sake of storytelling. Otherwise, it would be dull. Dull and bland. And believe me, it is not. I want to preface by saying there are a lot of things that are reminiscent of Lord of the Rings, as far as the style of how some of the battles and the openings are constructed. But instead of us thinking that this has imitated Lord of the Rings, I think perhaps we should remember that there would be no Frodo, there would be no Luke Skywalker, there would be no Peyton Drake, there would be no regular guy plucked from obscurity if there hadn't been real life David. So not only does the House of David include the story structure of the hero's journey, but the hero's journey basically, if you ask me, all boils down to David himself. He started it all as far as Western civilization goes. The episode begins with voiceover by a character named Michal. We don't know yet what her name is, but after you've watched it, you'll realize who it is. We see the big fight between the Israelites holding their pitchforks and the Philistines with their advanced bronze weaponry and armor. At the time, only a couple of characters such as the King Saul, his son Prince Jonathan, maybe a couple of others as generals, would have had actual metal swords. The rest of the Israelite army was using whatever they had on hand. I have to admit, when I saw Goliath come out, I personally was disappointed, which is ridiculous. It's not as if we weren't going to get to him eventually. I just wanted to have the big reveal be later in the series when we finally get to David fighting Goliath. I'm not sure if I heard this correctly or not, but if I did, my understanding is that when they showed the first episode to focus groups, the group just wasn't quite getting into what was going on, and so they felt they needed to establish the David and Goliath portion of the story, knowing that we wouldn't get back to it until much later. So there is a little bit of this at the beginning, and it does cut off at a very interesting point. Speaking of interesting points, I will say that there are things in the series that are not strictly biblical, as you were told in the disclaimer, but it doesn't mean that they didn't happen. They are what would be considered plausible. For example, we don't know exactly how the Philistines reacted in detail when they saw David cut off Goliath's head. We know that they fled, but was that all of them? Did any of them stay and fight? Did Goliath actually throw a spear or javelin or whatever at David? We have the highlights of the story in Samuel in the Bible. But a lot of what House of David posits could be true or not. Also, when it comes to characters, we might see what would be called composite characters. For example, you can't put in all of David's brothers. He had a lot of them. The show would have to pay a lot for all of those actors. And as usually happens in shows taken from a book, you need to condense the characters, and sometimes you make a composite character of a few different characters. They represent the spirit of those characters without being a line-by-line, character-by-character representation. We first meet David in episode 1, tending sheep. And later, when we start looking at each character in their own little videos per episode, we'll see how David's incredible faith for which he was known in great part was a consequence of the solitude he experienced as a shepherd. It was just him, the sheep, and God. If a lion attacked, a bear attacked, a person attacked, he had no one there to help him. The sheep weren't going to help him. It was just him and God. So when we see in this first episode the poet shepherd playing his lyre, and then we hear that there's a lion attack, David doesn't have weapons. If the Israelite army didn't have weapons beyond pitchforks, what do you think a little shepherd boy is going to have? And speaking of the idea of a shepherd boy, there are a lot of different theories on how old David was at the time of these stories. I'm going with the consensus that I found, which would put him at about age 15. And based on an average of the other timelines I've looked at, we're going to go with the idea of if David was about 15 at the time the Goliath incident took place, Saul would have been about 62, and Jonathan 42. Literally, there was a huge age difference between Jonathan and David. But back to where we are in the story now. David alone with his little sheep, knowing that there's a lion out there close by, ravaging the flock, takes a few deep breaths, pulls out his sling that is his go-to weapon, so to speak, and he stands ready to do battle with the lion with his sling. The lion's now gone, and so David takes his flock back home and tends to one of the injured sheep. You can see on his face he is not looking forward to going inside and having to hear from his dad about losing sheep. When he gets inside, having put the little lamb somewhere safe, he finds his father recounting a tale of Israeli history to family and friends. David basically snuck in the back. He's supposed to be out in the pasture with the sheep. One of David's brothers, Nathaniel, sort of like Nathaniel, comes and gives David a hard time saying, shouldn't you be out with the flock instead of here, shepherd? I saw what you brought back, the injured sheep. And he's like, where were you? Why weren't you paying attention? Just giving them a really hard time and saying, oh, I bet you were off thinking of your mother. To which David retorts, speak of my mother again, after puffing himself up in defiance. Throughout this first episode, we learn that David's mother had passed away, and that for a variety of reasons, David feels like an outcast. When he talks to his father about what happened with the sheep, he tells his father we lost 4. And his father, Jesse, says, David, I'm not a wealthy man. We can't afford to lose the sheep. David's like, well, let them graze somewhere else. They can't graze where they are now. So they get into a little bit of a discussion about where to graze and about the lion. Jesse said, oh, that lion's gone. And David said, oh, no, it's not. I'm telling you, it's the same one. We should get some men and go deal with the lion once and for all. Jesse is quiet on the subject because other men won't come. David is an outcast. He's considered a bastard. There is what you would either call biblical or historic precedent for that conclusion, based on some of David's own Psalms, and this idea that when Jesse married Netsevet, Jesse's wife became pregnant with David. There were some very unusual circumstances that even though they were married, it wasn't a pure and righteous situation. The reality of it sounds like something out of a Mozart operatic farce, but the way they decided to deal with it in House of David makes a lot more sense, and it helps the story move along in a much less confusing way. So, after his little spat with his dad, he goes to where he says he belongs, which is alone, out to pasture. Just him and God. While David's trying to figure out what so many of us are trying to figure out, who are we? What is our purpose? From there, we see a sweet flashback of David as a young boy with his mom when she was teaching him how to play the lyre. And from this little moment of sweet music, we are taken directly to a scene of battle elsewhere, which is happening at the same time, and this is with the house of Saul. We see Saul's son, Prince Jonathan, a renowned warrior, fighting, realizing the victory is theirs against the Amalekites. They were told by the prophet Samuel to keep nothing after this battle. Do not take the people as slaves. Destroy everything from the king to the wine to the population to the animals. Literally wipe it out. Keep no spoils of war whatsoever. But Saul decided to do otherwise. He used rational reasoning and logic, which would tell you if they've got good wine, if they've got grains, if they've got metal, if they've got things we can take to prosper, let's do that. That just makes good sense. It does make good common sense, but it's definitely not God sense. So that's what he did. He didn't slay the ruler, King Agag. He wanted to humiliate him and chain him up at his feet. They didn't slaughter the population. They took some of them as slaves. They drank the wine. They gave their own people, who just fought with them, the spoils of war in thanks for their loyalty and service. Makes total sense to the normal way of thinking. Doesn't make sense if you're trying to follow God the way Samuel had directed. When word gets to Jonathan that there are little border villages that are under attack, he decides to go check them out and takes a couple people with him. Notably, biblical characters Joab and Eliab, what we would normally call Joab and Eliab. Joab, Joab, was a warrior that you can read about in the Bible, and Eliab was David's oldest brother, who was strong, hardy, handsome, the hero of the family. When they get to the border village, there are some things they cannot account for, like arrows the size of spears, and a handprint, as Jonathan says, larger than a weaver's basket. What does this look like? It looks like the work of giants. But there's no such thing as giants, is there? When we cut back to David, it's the next day and he and his dad kind of make up, and then you hear screams from the household, where a relative or neighbor, a young girl named Ava, who is close to David, is screaming, and you hear a lion roar. So David rushes to save her. The lion ends up leaving, but what comes of it is David decides he is sick of waiting and doing nothing in his life, so he thinks, and he decides to go face the lion on his own. A shepherd boy with a knife for shearing sheep is going after the apex predator of the land. Back in Saul's camp, we're introduced to the women in the house of Saul. The queen's name, I have looked up how to say it, and I can't get a consensus. It's either Ahinoam or Ahinoam. I will probably say both or either because I just cannot get this straight and I haven't really found a definitive answer on that. Any suggestions? So we meet the sisters, Michal, who's the younger sister, and Mirab, who's the older sister. They're the sisters of Jonathan, daughters of Saul. We're then introduced to Eshbal, also called something like Ishbosheth. There's another name for him in the Bible, but that is the younger brother, kind of portrayed in this at least as the ne'er-do-well. He's the partier. He wants the wine and women and spoils of war. Rather a layabout. He was not off to war with Jonathan. And again, Jonathan is not just the king's son. He is the most formidable warrior there is. We're introduced to Avner, which we usually pronounce Abner, who was, I believe, the uncle to Saul, but he was also his advisor and general and all that good stuff. In the episode, when Jonathan goes to talk to his dad, he's like, what's the deal? Why is King Agag still alive? Why do we still have their wine? Why did we not do what the prophet Samuel said? And we get back to the regular, rational reasons that somebody would give. Saul says, who am I going to thank? An old man prophet who's failing? Or the people who helped us and put their lives on the line for us? And Saul has erected what's called is it a stela? Which is a monument to himself, basically, for the glory of his house. Jonathan's like, shouldn't we be glorifying God? And Saul's like, well, glorifying us is glorifying God. The issue of the giants is brought up on the border village, and Saul says there haven't been giants around since the time of Joshua. So that's telling us that giants were believed to have been a real thing, but just not anymore. When Jonathan brings up the fact that the spoils of war have been taken, and they did not utterly destroy everything like Samuel had told them to do, Saul rationalizes that Samuel's time is done. The age of the judges is over, and now it's up to kings like me to decide what's the way to go. We're the stewards of Israel. And when Jonathan brings up the fact that Samuel speaks for God, Saul's like, why can't God speak directly to me? After all, I'm his anointed. And Jonathan brings up, yes, anointed by Samuel. And they don't really get anywhere. And we see that Saul uses logic, and Jonathan is just like, I am not into these politics. This is not my thing. We then cut to Samuel, who, by the way, steals every scene he is in. You will know the actor Stephen Lang primarily, probably, from Avatar as the army commander. He is fantastic as Samuel. He gives him levity and humor without being a buffoon or comic relief, really. He's just great. His wife's even better, by the way. We'll get to that. We see Samuel having found out from God that Saul has gone off the deep end in glorifying himself and being disobedient to God's law and God's directives. Those chickens come home to roost a little later in the episode. Cutting back to the festivities at the battleground where the family of Saul is there celebrating, Samuel interrupts the festivities and Saul says, "Yay, it's the prophet. Are you here to celebrate with us?" Knowing full well that that's not why he's here. It says, "You were told to utterly destroy the Amalekites, not keep the king at your feet chained up, not share their wine." Saul finally says, "Please talk to me in private. You're embarrassing me." They have a big talk, and it comes out that Samuel says, "You are no longer answering to the Lord. You're putting yourself and your glory above everything." And Saul says, "I'm not going to listen to you, some jealous old man. Why should I listen to you?" And Samuel says, "I loved you like a son." And Saul's like, and yet your own sons did not love you. A very low blow, alluding to the fact that Samuel's sons did not follow him into the prophetic line. They were more like Eshbal. They were kind of partiers. They had it easy. They weren't interested in God's word. When we have a little character conversation about Saul, we'll bring up how he became king in the first place. He was the first king of Israel. So, in his discussion with Samuel, Saul professes his interest in making amends. "I'll sacrifice with you. You can fix this." And Samuel says, "Oh, I can't. This is out of my hands. I have tried. God would not listen. There's nothing I can do. You are no longer anointed. The Spirit of the Lord is no longer on you." When Saul protests, "But I did what he said. I destroyed the Amalekites." And he's like, "No, you didn't." He's like, "Well, then I'll sacrifice." Samuel tells him, obedience is better than sacrifice. And Saul's embarrassed. "You shame me in front of the tribes of Israel." So it's all about him wanting to be important, wanting to be the big man, wanting all the benefits that come from being king. Throughout this, Samuel is calm, cool, collected, humble, everything you would want from a so-called man of God. And this is when Samuel lowers the boom and says, "God has told me I regret that I ever made Saul king." The kingdom is stripped from him. For dramatic effect, there are some supernatural elements taking place, like a huge storm outside for no reason at all, which adds to the suspense and drama and is delightful. Saul tries to reason and excuse his way out of it. "I did what God said." And Samuel says, "If you did, then why is Agag under your table?" Saul justifies it. "Well, I wanted to humiliate him first." "No, that's not what you were told to do." And Saul again tries to reason his way out of the situation. "I created a unified kingdom about all of these scattered tribes. I united them." And Samuel dresses him down. He's like, "You built a kingdom? You?" Implying it was God. Saul basically begs. Samuel tells him, "It is out of my hands. You have rebelled. You've twisted the throne of Israel to your own glory, so you will be given to a twisted power and your own torment. And it will be a mental torment. So this will all be going on in his own mind." One of the greatest lines is, as a last-ditch Hail Mary, Saul explains, "I know I did these things, but it's because I was afraid of the people." And Samuel's like, "Afraid of the people? You feared them? Why would you not fear God more? Your allegiance is to the wrong thing. You're attributing power to the wrong camp." And that's when Saul's like, "I kept the best of everything to sacrifice." And Samuel says, "You know what? To obey is better than sacrifice," because he wasn't told to keep the best back. And Samuel tells him to heed is better than the fat of rams, meaning the part of the sacrifice. When Samuel goes to leave, Saul grasps at Samuel's cloak or robe. And when Samuel yanks it away, it tears, showing us that the kingdom has been torn from Saul. This is heartbreaking for Samuel. He anointed Saul when Saul was just a boy, and he begged and pleaded in his prayers to God for God to forgive Saul, but it was a no-go. And he says, "Just as you have rejected the Lord now rejects you." Samuel flat out tells Saul, "Jonathan will never rule. It will be someone else. And God has torn the kingdom from you and given it to one greater than you." And who is this greater one? A teenager in a cave with a torch looking for a lion. While David is in there searching, not finding anything other than bones of previous prey, we see behind him, stealthy as only a cat can be, the lion creeping up. David says, "I'm tired of being afraid." He recounts the words of Joshua, "Be strong and courageous. Do not fear." Cutting away back to Saul's camp, we see Samuel visit King Agag himself and take matters into his own hands. King Agag says, "Surely Saul's wrath has abated." And Samuel says, "Yes, it has, but God's hasn't." And he runs King Agag through. In the Bible, it's much more violent. It says he basically hacked him to pieces. With that, Samuel flings the bloody sword and leaves, making a point to spit on King Agag's remains first, just for good measure. Cutting back to David, it's now the next morning. We see a beautiful vista of a new day, and David hobbling a little out of the cave, clearly alive, and if he's hurt, it's not too badly. A weary smile crosses his face as he thinks about his mother, and he pulls from his pouch a couple of claws from the lion that he took. As the scene ends on Samuel and his apprentice Silas, which we would call Silas, Silas asks, "Where are we going now?" And Samuel answers, "To find a king." David's triumphant scream ends the episode. So, that's your plot overview. The themes in here are about doing things for your glory versus the glory of God. And God, for some people, is whatever they hold in highest value. Saul was doing things out of fear of the people. David was coming from a place of, I don't want to say fearlessness, that he had fear, he just chose to face it. He chose to stand up to it. Whereas Saul chose to bow down to his and appease the people. The summarized version of a shepherd and a king is that we see a king's fall and a hero's call. King Saul has grown arrogant and prideful in his long reign, and we see in his victorious campaign against the Amalekites that while he is successful, Saul disobeys by sparing the king and keeping the best of the livestock and spoils for his own honor and to give to his men and the people. And now that the Spirit of the Lord is coming off of him, it will be replaced by a spirit of torment. Meanwhile, we meet David, an outcast, a simple shepherd living in Bethlehem. He's framed as being of illegitimate birth. David, who's off on his own much of the time with the sheep, without a lot of human contact, is a talented musician, often singing and playing his lyre. However, he's not just a man of arts, he's a man of action. There's a lion that's been plaguing his family's flocks and homestead, and we see David go off on his own, saying he's had enough. He is going to fight the lion by himself. The key themes in this episode are the house of God versus the house of man. King Saul represents the house of man, a leader who prioritizes his own glory, the acclaim of his people, and political expediency over direct obedience to God. So whereas he feared what the people would do if he didn't give them all this stuff, giving them all that stuff is exactly what led to his own downfall. Another theme is courage versus fear. Remember, David's father Jesse said, "Fear's the enemy. Fear's the thief." Well, Saul feared the people, and look where that got him. David chose to face his fear and face the lion. Look where that got him, moving closer to his destiny as a leader and a warrior, whereas Saul moved closer to his destiny of having the kingdom ripped away from him. What are your thoughts on this first episode? Anything in particular you liked? Anything that didn't really work for you? Any characters you enjoy more than others? There are a few fun Easter eggs here and there, and one of them was when a character named Adriel, he's the older guy with the deep voice and the graying hair. He was giving a toast to the house of Saul, and he winks at Mirab, the older sister, Saul's daughter. Mirab returns a look of repulsion like, "Ew, old guy flirting with me, that's gross." Little does she know, in the biblical story, that's exactly who she is sent off to marry. And I'm not sure if I will get this right, but I think they maybe have 5 sons together. And through some very, very sad circumstances, they're all killed. We can look into that later. But for now, how are you feeling about our king? And how are you feeling about our shepherd? Looking forward to hearing your thoughts and being back with you to talk a little bit more about the characters before we get into episode 2. And remember, fear is the enemy. Wishing you a bold and courageous day.